1946, Dresden, Germany. The war had been over for months. Newspapers spoke about rebuilding. Radios talked about peace. Officials counted bricks, food, and survivors. But in the Altstadt district of Dresden, the war had not finished asking its questions. This part of the city had been burned so completely in 1945 that even time seemed unsure how to move forward. Walls stood without roofs. Streets ended where buildings had collapsed into themselves. Ash still hid in the cracks of the pavement, refusing to be washed away. Every morning, one man walked into that silence. His name was Daniel Harper. He was not German. He was not a soldier. And he was not supposed to still be here. Daniel wore the same worn coat every day. It had once been brown, now it was the color of dust. His shoes made no sound as he walked, as if even they had learned not to disturb the city. He entered the same street at the same hour. People noticed him. Some slowed down. Some crossed to the other side. Some pretended not to see him at all. Because everyone knew where he was going. At the end of the street stood what was left of a house. Or rather, what had been left of a house after the firestorm. There was no roof. Only one wall still stood upright. The rest had collapsed inward, as if the building had folded under the weight of memory. And there was no door. Not anymore. The frame had burned. The hinges had melted. Even the outline where the wood once rested had nearly disappeared. But Daniel stopped there anyway. Every day. He stood in front of empty space, breathed in slowly, and raised his hand. Then he opened the door. People whispered about him. Trauma, some said. Guilt, others guessed. A few used the word madness. No one ever asked him why. Because in a city like Dresden, after a war like that, everyone carried something they did not want to explain. Daniel did not look around when he stood there. He did not speak. He did not cry. He simply opened the door, stepped forward once, and then stepped back again. As if entering a moment that no longer existed. As if checking whether something had changed. It never had. Daniel had arrived in Dresden in 1944, months before the city would burn. Back then, he was an administrative clerk attached to an American logistics unit, paperwork, translations, delivery records. He was not trained to kill. He was trained to keep track. He believed, foolishly, that paper made things safer. That belief died here. What no one in the Altstadt knew was that Daniel was not opening an imaginary door. He was reopening a decision. A decision that had been made on a quiet evening, before the fire, before the ashes, before the lists of the dead. A decision that involved a child. And a question Daniel had never been able to answer. If a war ends, does guilt end with it? Daniel asked himself that question every morning. And every morning, the answer waited behind a door that no longer existed. 1944, Dresden, Altstadt. Before the city burned, Dresden still pretended it was safe. Shops opened for a few hours each morning. Trams ran on shortened routes. People spoke in lower voices but continued speaking nonetheless, as if volume alone could summon bombs. Daniel remembered that day clearly, not because something dramatic happened at first, but because nothing did. It was raining. Not the kind of rain that cleans the air, but the kind that settles into stone and stays there. Daniel had finished delivering documents to a temporary administrative office near the river. The building shook slightly every time an aircraft passed far overhead, but no alarms sounded. He was supposed to return immediately. Instead, he walked. Walking was the only time his thoughts stayed quiet. Altstadt felt different before the firestorm. Fragile, but still standing. Windows were boarded, but intact. Doors still existed. People still believed in thresholds. Daniel passed the house without noticing it at first. He would later hate himself for that. The building was ordinary, 2 stories, narrow, its paint peeling from years of neglect rather than bombs. The door was wooden, darkened by rain, its handle polished smooth by hands that no longer came back. Daniel had already taken several steps past it when he heard the sound. A knock. Not loud. Not urgent. Barely there. He stopped. In war, hesitation is dangerous. So is curiosity. Daniel told himself it was nothing. Someone inside, perhaps. The rain shifting. Wood swelling. Then the sound came again. 3 soft taps. Daniel turned. The street was empty. No patrols. No neighbors. Just the sound of rain and the weight of quiet. He approached the door slowly. Another knock. This time, he heard something beneath it. Breathing. Daniel stood with his hand inches from the handle and felt the first warning rise in his chest. Not fear, responsibility. The kind that comes before regret. He told himself to walk away. He didn't. When he opened the door, the world did not change immediately. A boy stood there. He was smaller than Daniel expected. Thin. Wrapped in a coat that clearly wasn't his. The sleeves reached past his hands. His hair was damp and clung to his forehead. His eyes were dry. That struck Daniel harder than tears would have. "Can I come in?" the boy asked. His German was careful, precise, as if he had practiced the sentence many times and finally chosen this door. Daniel looked down the street again. Still empty. He knew what he should do. He should close the door. He should say no. He should pretend he hadn't heard the knock. Instead, he stepped aside. The boy entered without hesitation, as if he had already decided this would happen. Daniel closed the door behind them. That sound, the latch clicking into place, would follow him for the rest of his life. Inside, the house smelled of damp wood and something faintly sweet, like old bread. Furniture was sparse. A table. 2 chairs. A stove that hadn't been used in days. The boy stood still, unsure. "What's your name?" Daniel asked. "Elijah," the boy said after a pause. "But everyone calls me Eli." "How old are you?" Eli shrugged. 10. Maybe. That answer contained more truth than a number ever could. Daniel gave him water. Then bread. Eli ate slowly, methodically, as if food was something that could disappear if rushed. "Where are your parents?" Daniel asked gently. Eli did not answer. Daniel waited. The boy looked at the floor. "The house went away," he said. Daniel understood. In Dresden, houses didn't fall. They vanished. "You can stay until the rain stops," Daniel said. Eli nodded. The rain didn't stop that day. Or the next. Daniel told himself he was being careful. That he was just waiting for the right moment to take the boy to an aid station, or to ask around quietly. He told himself he was not keeping the boy. But nights passed. Air raids intensified. Streets emptied. And each evening, Eli sat near the stove and stared into nothing. He never cried. Never asked for anything. Never spoke unless spoken to. Daniel noticed small things. How Eli flinched at sudden sounds. How he slept sitting up. How he watched the door as if expecting it to disappear. On the 3rd night, Daniel realized something that frightened him more than bombs ever had. He no longer remembered why he hadn't taken the boy away. It felt normal now. The house, the silence, the child sitting at the table, it all felt like a life. That was when the knock came again. Not gentle this time. Hard. Loud. Demanding. Daniel froze. Eli's eyes moved to him instantly. No panic. Just understanding. "Basement," Daniel mouthed. Eli stood and walked toward the stairs without a sound. The knock came again, closer, angrier. Daniel opened the door. Men stood outside. Boots wet. Faces unreadable. They asked questions. Daniel answered some. Then they stepped inside. What happened next would never appear in any report. There were no witnesses. No lists. No records. Only silence. And when Daniel finally went down into the basement, Eli was gone. Daniel stayed in the basement longer than he should have. At first, he told himself he was listening, waiting for footsteps, voices, anything that would explain what had just happened. The walls were damp. The air smelled like soil and old coal. Water dripped somewhere in the dark, steady and indifferent. Eli, he whispered. No answer. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step heavier than the last. The house above felt wrong now, as if it had shifted when Eli left. The table was still there. The cup Daniel had given him sat half full. A crumb of bread rested near the edge, untouched. Daniel stood in the doorway and understood something with terrifying clarity. Whatever had happened, it had happened quickly. He searched the house anyway. He checked behind the stove, under the table, even the small cupboard where no child could fit. He opened the door to the street and looked both ways, rain cutting his vision into narrow lines. Nothing. No footprints. No voices. No trace. Daniel closed the door and leaned against it, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor. That was the first time he noticed Eli's shoes. They were still by the door. Small. Worn. Carefully placed side by side. Eli had not run. He had not been taken by force. Daniel did not cry. That frightened him more than anything else. The next morning, Dresden was louder. Not with bombs, those would come later, but with rumors. People spoke in fragments, glances, unfinished sentences. Trucks moved through the streets. Papers changed hands. Daniel walked through the city with Eli's shoes wrapped in cloth and hidden under his coat. He did not know what he was looking for. He only knew that standing still would mean admitting something he was not ready to name. He went to the nearest aid post. They asked for a name. Elijah, Daniel said. A surname? Daniel hesitated. I don't know. Age? 10. Maybe. The woman behind the desk paused, then wrote nothing. No family? She asked. Daniel shook his head. She closed the ledger. Then there is nothing to record, she said softly. Daniel left. He tried another office. Then another. He learned quickly that names without papers did not exist, and children without witnesses disappeared easily in wartime cities. By evening, he stopped asking. That night, the bombing began. The firestorm that would erase Dresden came days later, but this was its beginning, the rehearsal. Sirens screamed. The sky turned the color of old bruises. Daniel ran with others into shelters and cellars, clutching nothing but the coat on his back. In the darkness, surrounded by strangers, he thought of Eli. Not as a missing child. But as a quiet presence. A chair left empty. A cup left half full. Shoes still waiting by a door that would soon burn. When the firestorm came, it came without mercy. Daniel survived by chance. By walls collapsing in the right direction. By being pulled out by hands he never saw again. When he returned to Altstadt days later, the house was gone. Not damaged. Gone. The street itself had changed shape. Familiar corners had folded into rubble. Smoke drifted where roofs had once been. Daniel stood where the door should have been and felt nothing. No grief. No panic. Only a hollow understanding. There would be no body. There would be no grave. Eli had vanished into the kind of absence that war creates, complete, unquestioned, final. Weeks passed. Then months. Daniel stayed. He stayed through occupation. Through rebuilding plans. Through new flags and new rules. He stayed because leaving would mean accepting that the door no longer mattered. But every morning, he returned to the same spot. He opened the door. And every morning, he remembered the same thing. Eli never cried. Not when he entered the house. Not when the knocks came. Not even when he went downstairs. Daniel began to understand why. Eli had already learned something Daniel had not. That crying only matters when someone is listening. There are nights that history keeps. And then there are nights that disappear so completely that even memory struggles to hold them. That night in Dresden was one of the latter. Daniel would later realize that no official report mentioned it. No incident log. No arrest record. No relocation notice. The kind of night that passes through a city like breath through ruins, felt, but never captured. It began quietly. The knock had not sounded violent at first. It had sounded certain. As if whoever stood outside already knew the answer and was merely confirming it. When Daniel opened the door, the men did not rush in. They stood there, letting the rain speak for them. Their coats were dark. Their boots heavy. Their faces carried the practiced emptiness of people who had stopped asking why. They asked questions. Who lived here? How long had he been here? Who else was inside? Daniel answered carefully. Truthfully, where he could. Vaguely, where he had to. He told himself he was protecting Eli by not saying his name. One of the men stepped past him. Daniel did not stop him. That was the moment that would return to him every morning afterward, not the questions, not the boots, but that single step. A choice made without words. The basement door creaked as it opened. Daniel followed at a distance that felt safe and cowardly at the same time. The stairs were narrow. The light weak. Shadows moved in ways that suggested more than they revealed. No one raised a voice. That was what made it unbearable. When the men came back up, their expressions had not changed. They did not tell Daniel what they had found. They did not tell him what would happen next. They simply left. Daniel stood in the doorway long after the sound of boots had faded. The house felt larger now, stretched thin by absence. He went down into the basement alone. Eli was gone. The blanket Daniel had given him lay folded neatly against the wall. The small space where he had been sitting was empty, undisturbed. No signs of a struggle. No broken objects. Only order. That detail would haunt Daniel more than chaos ever could. Because order suggested cooperation. Years later, Daniel would still ask himself the same question. Had Eli gone willingly? Had he believed that silence was safer than resistance? Or had he simply learned, at 10 years old, that some moments do not allow for choice? Daniel never found an answer. The next morning, he woke to the sound of aircraft. The bombing that would erase Dresden came soon after, but even before the firestorm, the city had begun to shed its memory. Streets blurred. Buildings collapsed into indistinguishable shapes. By the time the fires were extinguished, the house was gone. The basement. The stairs. The door. All gone. Which meant there was no place left to search. After the war, when officials asked where Daniel had been during the bombing, he answered honestly. Here. They nodded and moved on. Because here was everywhere in Dresden. But what Daniel never said, what he never found a place to say, was that the night Eli disappeared had already destroyed the city for him. The firestorm had only made it official. Daniel stayed in Dresden because leaving would have required him to admit something unbearable. That there was nothing left to wait for. So he waited anyway. He waited in the Altstadt. In the street where the house had been. In front of the place where the door no longer existed. Every morning, he opened it. And every morning, he wondered whether the night that took Eli had also taken something else. Something he had not yet learned how to name. When the war officially ended, the city filled with paper. Lists replaced sirens. Forms replaced screams. Ink replaced blood. Daniel learned this quickly. He learned that survival was no longer enough, you had to be counted. He went to offices that no longer had walls. To desks set up in half-standing buildings. To clerks who spoke gently but looked tired of listening. They asked the same questions every time. Name. Age. Last known address. Family. Daniel answered what he could. Elijah, he would say. And every time, the pause would come. A pause that meant the same thing everywhere. No record. No papers, they would explain. No witness. No confirmation. Daniel stopped correcting them when they called Eli a case instead of a child. He understood now, the war had moved on, and it took its missing with it. Some nights, Daniel dreamed of lists with blank lines that never ended. In the mornings, he returned to the street. He opened the door. Years passed. Dresden rebuilt itself slowly, unevenly. New buildings rose beside old scars. Children played in places that had once been ash. Daniel aged quietly. He never spoke publicly. Never testified. Never accused anyone. There was nothing left to accuse. One afternoon, a young official stopped him near the Altstadt. You come here every day, the man said carefully. Why? Daniel did not answer immediately. Because the truth was not dramatic. The truth was small. I didn't stop them, Daniel said finally. The official waited for more. They didn't threaten me, Daniel continued. They didn't hurt me. They just walked past me. He looked at the place where the door had been. I let them. The official said nothing. There was no form for that kind of confession. That night, Daniel slept longer than usual. He dreamed of a door that stayed closed. One morning, Daniel did not come. The street noticed. A woman who sold bread paused near the ruins. A man who swept debris looked up. No one said anything. The space where Daniel stood remained empty. Days passed. Then weeks. The city continued. Somewhere else, a door opened. Somewhere else, a child knocked. But in the Altstadt, the door stayed closed. Not because it had disappeared. But because the man who kept it open had finally learned how to stop asking the question. The war ended in 1945. The guilt did not. But one day, even guilt grows tired. And when it does, silence takes its place.